originally published by Afterhours Archive 613. This audio edition is adapted from the original written article. Signals from the Dancefloor, Part 1. Warehouses, Frequencies, and the Underground. The building was never designed to be used this way. By day, it sat quietly among aging factories, rail lines, and industrial streets. Concrete walls carried the marks of another era. Steel beams stretched overhead. The building had once been part of the machinery that powered a city. At night, it became something else. The bass arrived first. Not as a song, but as a physical force. It traveled through concrete floors and crowded bodies. Light flashed across faces. Sweat gathered in the air. Strangers moved together in entranced rhythms they had never practiced. For a few hours, people from different neighborhoods, backgrounds, and experiences occupied the same temporary world. Outside the event, the city continued as normal. Inside, another kind of community was becoming a new form of experience, genre, and music. Looking back, it can be tempting to tell this story as a history of electronic music, a history of house music, a history of techno, a history of DJs, synthesizers, drum machines, and dance floors. Those things are important. However, they are not the entire story. The history of underground nightlife is ultimately a history of people creating safe spaces for themselves when existing institutions failed to provide them. It is a story about belonging, identity, participation, refuge, safety, and community. The music was essential and served as the bridge that brought these elements together. Yet music alone cannot fully explain why these spaces emerged or why they continue to reappear across generations. Long before live streams, social media platforms, recommendation algorithms, and digital communities, people gathered in warehouses, clubs, basements, and improvised venues to build something that existed for only a few hours before disappearing again by morning. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, underground nightlife scenes emerged across cities such as Chicago, Detroit, New York, and London, as communities created their own spaces for music, participation, expression, and belonging. The locations, technology, and people changed. The need for this type of experience remained remarkably consistent. To understand why underground nightlife continues to emerge today, it helps to look at two cities that would significantly help shape the future of electronic music and nightlife culture around the world. Chicago and Detroit. Cities after industry. During the late 1970s and early 1980s, both Chicago and Detroit were experiencing significant economic and social change. For decades, each city had been closely tied to manufacturing and industrial production. Factories, transportation networks, and industrial labor helped shape their identities and provided livelihoods for hundreds of thousands of workers. As industries contracted, relocated, automated, or disappeared entirely, many neighborhoods were transformed. Factories closed. Warehouses sat empty. Industrial districts became landscapes of uncertainty and reminders of a past when industry helped sustain communities, cities, and local economies. These changes created severe challenges for local communities, but they also unintentionally created opportunities. Large industrial spaces became available for uses their original builders had never imagined. At the same time, cultural life continued to evolve. People still needed places to gather. They still sought connection, expression, and release. Music became one influential way to create those spaces. Chicago and Detroit would become famous for the sounds that emerged from their nightlife scenes. However, the music was only one part of a larger story. The conditions that allowed house and techno to develop were shaped by economics, architecture, community, safety, and the search for belonging. Before these genres became global phenomena, they were local responses to local realities. The dance floor as refuge. Many histories of nightlife focus on records, equipment, and musical innovation. Those elements are important. But for many people who entered these spaces, it was the sense of community that kept them coming back. Throughout the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, clubs, dance spaces, and underground venues regularly served as gathering places for people who felt unwelcome elsewhere. Black communities, queer communities, LGBTQ+ communities, artists, outsiders, and people searching for acceptance frequently found forms of belonging in nightlife environments that were difficult to find in mainstream institutions. The dance floor offered something simple but powerful: the opportunity to exist, be present, and to participate without judgment and within a safe environment. To connect with others who understood experiences that were often marginalized or misunderstood elsewhere. These spaces were not perfect. They contained conflicts, divisions, and challenges of their own. Yet for many participants, they represented something rare, a place where identity could be expressed rather than hidden. Nightlife became more than entertainment. It was a new social infrastructure. The clubs and warehouses that helped shape electronic music culture often functioned as informal community centers, bringing together people who shared common experiences, aspirations, and struggles. In many ways, music served as a common language that bridged the gap. The deeper purpose was connection with like-minded people. Chicago, the warehouse, and the birth of house. One of the most influential venues in the history of electronic music was a Chicago club known simply as the Warehouse. During the late 1970s and early 1980s, the club became closely associated with Frankie Knuckles, whose sets blended disco, soul, electronic experimentation, and extended dance mixes. Knuckles would later become known as the godfather of house music for his role in shaping the genre's early development. The Warehouse was not important merely because of the records being played. It was important because of the communities and people who gathered there. The club attracted a diverse audience and fostered an environment where music, identity, and community intersected. Dancers were not passive consumers of entertainment. They actively shaped the atmosphere of the space through their participation. Over time, the sounds associated with the Warehouse became linked to the venue itself. The term house music is widely understood to have emerged from this cultural environment. As local DJs, producers, and dancers developed the sound further, house music became increasingly distinct from its disco roots. Drum machines, synthesizers, and new production techniques expanded what was possible while maintaining the dance floor-centered spirit that had defined the scene from the beginning. As the music evolved, the sense of community remained paramount. Detroit and the future sound of techno. While Chicago was developing house music during the late 1970s and early to mid-1980s, Detroit was cultivating a different but related musical language during the same period. The city had long been associated with innovation, industry, and musical experimentation. Motown had already demonstrated Detroit's cultural influence decades earlier, helping establish the city as one of the most important centers of American music. By the 1980s, a new generation of artists began exploring electronic sounds that reflected both the realities and possibilities of their environment. Detroit was experiencing significant economic challenges, population decline, and the continued effects of industrial restructuring. Yet amid these difficulties, artists were imagining futures that extended beyond the circumstances surrounding them. Electronic music became one way of expressing those possibilities. Juan Atkins, Derek May, and Kevin Saunderson, often referred to as the Belleville Three, became central figures in the development of what would later become known as techno. Working primarily throughout the early and mid-1980s, The group helped establish the foundations of techno and influenced electronic music far beyond Detroit. Unlike house music's roots in disco and club culture, techno often emphasized futurism, machine aesthetics, repetition, and electronic experimentation. The music reflected both the industrial environment surrounding the city and a fascination with technology, possibility, and imagined futures. Yet despite their musical differences, house and techno shared important foundations. Both emerged from communities rather than corporations, and grew through participation rather than mass marketing. They reflected local environments while imagining possibilities beyond them, and were developed within spaces where people gathered to create experiences that could not be fully replicated elsewhere. By the late 1980s, techno had begun spreading beyond Detroit into underground scenes across Europe, particularly in Germany and the United Kingdom, where it would help shape future rave and electronic music cultures. Pirate frequencies and underground networks. Before social media platforms, event discovery relied on very different systems. Information about parties spread through flyers, friends, local record stores, DJs, and word-of-mouth networks built on trust and community participation. In many places and scenes, pirate radio also played an important role. Pirate stations operated outside official broadcasting structures and helped distribute music, promote local events, and connect audiences with emerging scenes that often received little attention from mainstream media. These networks were often informal, decentralized, and heavily dependent on participation. People did not simply consume culture. They participated in it, lived it, and helped build it. Every flyer distributed, every recommendation shared, and every late-night pirate radio broadcast contributed to the growth of communities that existed largely outside mainstream visibility. Long before the internet and digital platforms promised connection, underground nightlife had already developed its own systems of communication, its own networks, methods of discovery, and its own language. Temporary cities. One of the most fascinating aspects of underground nightlife is how quickly it can transform an ordinary space. For a few hours, an empty warehouse becomes a gathering place, while a forgotten industrial building becomes a destination. A room full of strangers becomes a community. These environments operate almost like temporary cities, complete with their own social rules, rhythms, and forms of participation. People arrive from different places to share a collective experience and then disperse again before sunrise. Almost as if it were a dream, the city returns to normal, often unaware that an entirely different cultural landscape had briefly existed within it only hours earlier. The temporary world disappears as quickly as it appeared, yet the memory remains. Participants carry pieces of those experiences back into their daily lives. Friendships form, creative ideas emerge, local scenes evolve, cultural movements grow. While the physical space may be temporary, the impact was not. Why these spaces keep returning. The story of underground nightlife is not ultimately about warehouses, turntables, drum machines, synthesizers, or even specific genres. Those things are important to remember, but they are secondary to a deeper pattern. Across generations, people continue to create spaces that offer belonging, connection, participation, and refuge. The details, technology, and music change. The need remains. The warehouse parties of Chicago and Detroit emerged from specific historical circumstances, yet the forces that shaped them continue to appear in different forms around the world. People will always seek community and places where identity can be explored and expressed. They will continue searching for collective experiences that temporarily suspend the pressures of everyday life. That search did not end when house music spread beyond Chicago, nor did it end when techno left Detroit. In many ways, it was only the beginning. As underground communities discovered they could create entire worlds for themselves, those worlds rarely remained confined to a single city for long. Records moved between cities. DJs carried sounds across borders. Ideas spread through radio broadcasts, record shops, mixtapes, and word-of-mouth networks. New communities adopted these sounds and reshaped them through their own cultures, experiences, and identities. The music evolved, while the audience grew and the culture expanded. Yet the forces that created these spaces remained remarkably familiar. People still search for belonging and connection. They still create communities where they can participate rather than simply observe. The underground had found its voice, and it would not remain local for long. Part 2. From warehouses to festivals. What happens when underground culture becomes popular? The warehouse was never supposed to hold everyone. What began as local scenes in Chicago and Detroit had grown beyond the cities that created them. Records and DJs traveled. Communities expanded. Sounds that once circulated through clubs, warehouses, pirate radio broadcasts, and record shops were now appearing in cities thousands of miles from where they first emerged. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, house and techno were no longer confined to their places of origin. New scenes had emerged across Europe, particularly in the United Kingdom, Germany, the Netherlands, and beyond. Each adopted the music differently. Local communities reshaped the sounds through their own cultures, histories, and experiences. The music remained recognizable. However, the scenes did not remain identical. As underground nightlife expanded internationally, participation increased alongside visibility. More people discovered the music, while more promoters organized events and venues opened their doors. What had once existed primarily through local networks began attracting regional, national, and eventually international attention. For many participants, this growth felt exciting because the underground was no longer isolated. Communities that once struggled to find one another suddenly discovered they were part of something much larger. Yet that growth introduced new questions. Could underground culture remain underground once millions of people discovered it? Could communities built on participation survive increasing commercialization? What happens when a local movement becomes a global phenomenon? The answers were rarely simple. Throughout the late 1980s and 1990s, underground nightlife would experience one of the most significant transformations in its history. Illegal warehouse parties expanded into massive rave events. Independent scenes developed international connections, and media attention increased alongside them. Commercial interests arrived, and governments responded. New opportunities emerged alongside new tensions. The underground had left home. What happened next would reshape nightlife culture for decades to come. The music leaves home. As house and techno spread beyond Chicago and Detroit, they entered environments very different from those that had originally shaped them. In some cities, the music arrived through imported records, while in others it arrived through DJs returning from international travel. Record stores became important points of cultural exchange. New sounds circulated between local scenes, allowing underground communities to discover music that might otherwise have remained geographically isolated. House music found enthusiastic audiences in cities such as London, Manchester, and Amsterdam. Techno developed particularly strong footholds in Germany and parts of Western Europe. Each location added something new and evolved the sound. Local tastes, cultural influences, and nightlife traditions helped shape how the music evolved after arrival. The result was not a simple export of Chicago and Detroit culture. It was the beginning of an international conversation. The underground was becoming interconnected. The second summer of love. One of the most significant moments in the growth of electronic music culture occurred in the United Kingdom during the late 1980s. Often referred to as the second summer of love, the period between 1988 and 1989 saw the rapid expansion of acid house culture and large-scale dance gatherings across Britain. Young people gathered in warehouses, fields, industrial spaces, and temporary venues to participate in events that often existed outside traditional nightlife structures. Music remained central, as did the sense of community. Participants frequently described these gatherings as experiences that felt different from conventional nightlife. Social barriers often appeared less significant on the dance floor. Shared participation became the defining characteristic of the experience. For many attendees, the appeal extended beyond the music itself. The events offered belonging, connection, and the feeling of participating in something larger than themselves. The scale of the events was increasing. Nevertheless, many of the needs that had shaped earlier underground communities remained unchanged. Pirate radio flyers and underground infrastructure. Long before social media platforms, event promotion depended upon physical and community-based networks. Flyers circulated through record stores, clubs, cafes, and gathering spaces. Telephone chains spread information between trusted participants. Word-of-mouth recommendations remained essential. Pirate radio stations became particularly influential throughout the United Kingdom and other parts of Europe. These stations introduced audiences to emerging artists, promoted events, and helped connect communities that existed outside mainstream media coverage. Underground nightlife had developed sophisticated infrastructure long before digital platforms appeared. People knew where to find the music. They knew who to trust and how information moved through their communities. The systems may have been informal, but they were remarkably effective. Berlin after the wall. Few cities illustrate the relationship between physical space and nightlife culture more clearly than Berlin. Following the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the city entered a period of dramatic transformation. Industrial buildings, abandoned properties, and unused spaces became available throughout parts of the city. Artists, musicians, promoters, and communities quickly began experimenting with these environments. Techno became deeply connected to this moment. The music reflected both uncertainty and possibility. Many participants viewed these spaces as opportunities to build something new within a city that was itself redefining its identity. Clubs such as Trezor emerged from this environment and would later become internationally influential within techno culture. The architecture, history, and community mattered. Once again, underground nightlife demonstrated an ability to transform overlooked spaces into centers of cultural activity. When visibility changes everything, growth brought opportunities, but it also attracted attention. As rave culture expanded throughout the 1990s, media coverage increased significantly. What had once been understood primarily through underground networks became visible to wider audiences. Visibility changed the relationship between underground culture and the institutions surrounding it. Governments, law enforcement, and commercial interests paid attention. Sponsors, brands, and investors increasingly recognized the cultural and economic potential of large-scale events. For some participants, this represented validation. For others, it represented a threat. The underground was no longer hidden. From raves to festivals. As audiences grew, events grew with them. Small gatherings evolved into larger productions capable of attracting thousands and, in some cases, hundreds of thousands of attendees. Festivals became increasingly common. Large-scale events such as Love Parade, demonstrated how dramatically electronic music culture had expanded beyond its local origins. What began as underground participation was becoming public spectacle. This growth created new opportunities for artists, promoters, venues, and communities. It also introduced new questions. Could the intimacy of smaller scenes survive mass popularity? Could participation remain central when audiences reached enormous sizes? Could underground culture retain its identity while becoming globally visible? There were no universal answers. Communities responded in different ways. Some embraced growth, while others resisted it. Most existed somewhere in between. The tension. By the end of the 1990s, underground nightlife had developed into a larger and more complicated world than its founders could have imagined. The music had spread across continents, and new communities emerged. Entire industries had developed around sounds that once circulated primarily through local underground scenes. Yet many of the debates remained familiar. Questions surrounding authenticity, commercialization, visibility, and participation continued appearing wherever underground culture encountered mainstream attention. Growth had not solved these tensions. It amplified them. The underground was no longer confined to warehouses and local communities. It had become a global culture. The next transformation would arrive through a technology capable of connecting scenes faster than records, radio, flyers, or festivals ever could. The internet was waiting. Part 3. The new nightlife. What happens when the dance floor exists everywhere? Throughout most of nightlife history, participation depended upon physical presence. Whether inside a Chicago warehouse, a Detroit club, a British field party, or a Berlin techno venue, geography played a significant role in determining who could participate and who could not. People discovered music through local communities, record stores, radio broadcasts, flyers, promoters, and word-of-mouth recommendations. Access often depended on where someone lived and who they knew. By the early 2000s, that relationship was beginning to change. The internet was not replacing nightlife. It was reshaping how people discovered it, discussed it, documented it, and participated in it. The transformation happened gradually. Websites allowed communities to communicate across greater distances. Forums connected people who shared similar interests. Streaming platforms expanded access to music. Social media accelerated discovery. Live streams made performances visible to audiences far beyond the physical spaces where they occurred. The dance floor had not disappeared, and participation was no longer limited by geography alone. When visibility became participation. For much of nightlife history, experiencing an event generally required physical attendance. If someone could not access the venue, they often missed the experience entirely. Digital media began altering that relationship. Performances could now be recorded, uploaded, shared, discussed, and revisited almost immediately. Events that once existed only for those physically present could reach audiences far beyond their local communities. One of the clearest examples emerged through the Boiler Room project. Originally launched in London in 2010 as a small online broadcasting project, Boiler Room helped transform how electronic music performances were distributed and experienced. Sets recorded in clubs, warehouses, and performance spaces could now be viewed by audiences across the world. This did not replace physical participation, but it did expand access. People who might never attend a particular event could still engage with the music, artists, and surrounding culture. Visibility itself became a new form of participation. The internet and the camera altered the relationship between performer, audience, and venue. A local event could suddenly become an international event. Communities that once existed primarily through physical gathering spaces now had the ability to extend beyond the room itself. The dance floor became visible to a far wider audience. Algorithms become the new flyers. Before the internet, discovering music often required effort. People visited record stores, spoke with DJs, listened to radio broadcasts, collected flyers, and relied on recommendations from trusted members of their communities. The process was imperfect, but it was deeply human. Digital platforms introduced a different model. Streaming services, social media platforms, video sharing websites, and recommendation systems increasingly became responsible for helping audiences discover new artists and communities. Rather than searching for every artist individually, listeners often encountered music through playlists, suggested videos, curated feeds, and algorithmic recommendations. The shift fundamentally altered how discovery occurred. A teenager no longer needed access to a local club scene to discover house music. A listener interested in techno no longer needed a nearby record store specializing in electronic music. Communities that once relied heavily on geography could now be discovered through a search bar or a recommendation feed. The old systems did not disappear entirely. Word-of-mouth recommendations, communities, and personal relationships remained valuable. Only the mechanisms of discovery had changed. In many ways, the flyer had evolved into a digital form. Communities without geography. One of the most significant changes brought by internet culture involved the relationship between community and location. Historically, scenes often emerged within specific cities, neighborhoods, and venues. Local identity played a major role in shaping how communities developed. Chicago helped shape house music. Detroit helped shape techno. Berlin helped shape modern club culture. The internet weakened many of these geographic barriers. Online forums, social media groups, live stream chats, Discord servers, and other digital spaces allowed people to participate regardless of physical location. Someone interested in Detroit techno could learn from artists, fans, and historians without ever visiting Detroit. Someone fascinated by house music could connect with listeners around the world without stepping inside a Chicago club. Communities became increasingly global, creating opportunities that previous generations could scarcely imagine. For previous generations, participation often depended upon physical proximity. People generally experienced scenes where they lived. Local clubs, venues, radio stations, and community networks helped shape how people encountered music and culture. The internet complicated that relationship. Knowledge, music, performances, and discussions became accessible regardless of location. Communities that once developed primarily through local interaction increasingly developed through shared interests. This created opportunities for cultural exchange on a scale that would have been difficult to imagine during the warehouse era. It also raised new questions about identity, authenticity, and local culture. As communities became increasingly global, the relationship between place and participation continued to evolve. The internet expanded access, but it also transformed the meaning of place and community. The pandemic and the acceleration of digital participation. The relationship between nightlife and digital participation changed dramatically during the COVID-19 pandemic. Around the world, clubs closed, festivals paused, and tours were canceled. Many of the physical spaces that had traditionally supported nightlife suddenly became unavailable, and communities adapted. Artists experimented with live stream performances, while virtual events expanded. Digital spaces became temporary gathering places during a period when physical gathering was often impossible. The experience was different. Watching a performance through a screen could not fully replicate the sensory experience of standing inside a crowded venue, surrounded by hundreds of other participants. The COVID-19 period revealed something important. Communities could adapt and survive, even when physical venues temporarily disappeared. People continued seeking connection, sharing music, and creating spaces for participation. Atmosphere culture and the modern underground. As digital participation expanded, many communities began organizing around atmosphere as much as genre. Traditional genre labels remained important, but listeners increasingly gathered around shared experiences, moods, aesthetics, and identities. Night drive playlists, late-night mixes, study sessions, gaming streams, atmospheric visualizers, and livestream channels all became part of the broader cultural landscape. Electronic music became intertwined with experiences and emotional environments that extended beyond traditional nightlife spaces. The internet facilitated these connections and made them easier to build and share. People often discovered communities through a feeling before they discovered a genre. This shift helped create new pathways into underground culture. Someone searching for a particular mood might eventually discover an artist. An artist might lead to a community. A community might lead to an entire scene. Participation increasingly occurred through networks of shared experiences, rather than strictly through geographic proximity. This shift also changed how many people discovered music itself. Previous generations often entered scenes through specific genres, venues, artists, or local communities. Modern audiences increasingly encounter music through experiences, moods, and activities. A late-night driving playlist may introduce someone to electronic music. A live stream might lead to a new artist. A gaming video, social media clip, or curated recommendation may become the first point of entry into a larger community. In many cases, people now discover scenes indirectly. They encounter an atmosphere first and a genre second. The result is a nightlife culture that often extends beyond traditional nightlife spaces. Participation can occur in clubs and festivals, but it can also occur through live streams, online communities, digital media, and shared cultural experiences. Phonk and the global underground. Few modern genres illustrate these changes more clearly than phonk. Originally influenced by Memphis rap, underground hip-hop production, cassette culture, and southern independent music traditions, phonk evolved into a global phenomenon through internet platforms, digital production tools, social media, streaming services, and online communities. Many listeners did not discover phonk through local scenes. They discovered it through drifting videos, gaming content, gym edits, social media clips, playlists, and algorithmic recommendations. The genre's growth demonstrated how dramatically music culture had changed since the warehouse era. A sound rooted in one region could be adopted, adapted, and reinterpreted by communities around the world. The internet accelerated that process, and participation no longer depended upon geography. Communities formed around shared interests. Artists built networks across countries and continents. Audiences discovered cultures that had once been tied to specific regions and local scenes. The technology changed, but many of the social dynamics remained familiar. What hasn't changed? The history of nightlife is often told through venues, cities, technologies, and genres. Chicago, Detroit, and Berlin. Warehouses, festival, live streams, and algorithms. Each represents a different chapter in a much larger story. Yet the deeper pattern remains remarkably consistent. People continue creating communities around shared interests, experiences, and forms of participation. The methods have evolved, but the impulse remains familiar. The warehouse was never only a building. The festival was never only an event. The livestream is not simply a broadcast. Each represents a space where people gather, participate, and contribute to something larger than themselves. What changed over the past several decades was not the desire to participate. What changed was access. For much of nightlife history, geography determined who could take part. Today, participation can begin almost anywhere. The dance floor no longer exists solely inside a building. It exists across cities, countries, communities, platforms, and cultures connected through shared experiences. Nightlife did not disappear in the digital era. It expanded beyond the limits that once defined it. This audio edition was adapted from the original written article published by Afterhours Archive 613. References and source materials are available in the original written article published by Afterhours Archive 613.